The papers. The divorce papers were already signed. Her name was on the dotted line in that familiar looping cursive I'd watched her practice as a teenager when she thought signatures were romantic. The date typed at the top read tomorrow, March 17th, and I found them at 11:43 p.m. on March 16th, stuffed beneath a folded sweater in the back of her drawer. The same drawer where she used to keep the birthday cards. The ones I'd written her every year without fail for 9 years. I stood in our bedroom. The bedroom we'd painted together. The bedroom where we'd cried happy tears after our third IVF attempt finally worked. The bedroom that still had my grandmother's quilt folded at the foot of the bed. And I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Not metaphorically. My knees actually buckled. I grabbed the dresser with one hand, the papers crinkling in the other. And I just breathed for a moment because breathing was the only thing I could still control. Her name was Claire. My wife. The woman I'd loved since we were 22 years old. Both sitting in the same graduate school orientation. Her laughing at something her friend said. Her hair falling across her face. And me thinking, that's the one. That's the person I want to build everything with. I hadn't been wrong about that feeling. I'd just been wrong about her. 3 weeks before I found those papers, Claire had been sitting across from me at our kitchen table, eating the pasta I'd cooked, telling me about her day at the architecture firm where she worked. She had a project deadline coming up. She said she was stressed. She needed me to handle more of the household stuff for a while. I said, of course. I always said, of course. I adjusted my schedule. Worked from home more. Handled drop-off and pick-up for our 7-year-old daughter, Emma. Cooked dinner every night. Made sure Claire came home to a clean house and a calm environment, because that was what I thought a good husband did. 2 weeks before I found those papers, she'd kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work and said, "What would I do without you, Kev?" She'd smiled at me with those brown eyes I'd memorized in every lighting condition across 9 years of marriage. And I'd smiled back and said, "You'll never have to find out." She'd already found out. She'd already decided. She'd already signed the papers. And the man she'd signed them for, the man she was planning to run toward the moment the ink was legally processed, was Daniel Holt, her ex-boyfriend from college. Or the one she'd told me was just a friend when I saw his name appear in her texts over a year ago. The one she'd assured me with tears in her eyes and her hand on my chest was absolutely nothing to worry about. The one I'd believed her about because she was my wife and I was a fool who loved her completely. I know now that they'd been communicating for a year and a half. I know because after I found those papers, I didn't put them back. I sat down on the edge of the bed and I opened her laptop. The password was Emma's birthday. It had always been Emma's birthday. And I read everything. Every message. Every email. Every deleted thread she thought she'd hidden. I found them all. The plan laid out in their messages with a casualness that made my stomach heave. It was elegant in the way that only truly selfish people can be elegant. Claire would file the papers tomorrow. She'd pre-sign them to speed up the process. She'd already spoken to a divorce attorney, a woman named Patricia Graves, whose email I found in a separate folder Claire had labeled Work Contacts. She'd structured the filing to request the house, primary custody of Emma, and a division of our joint savings that would leave me with approximately 30% of what we'd built together. Daniel had already put a deposit on an apartment in Denver. Claire had already told Emma that Mommy might be moving somewhere exciting soon and framed it as an adventure. My daughter, my 7-year-old, had already been softened for the blow without my knowledge or consent. But the affair hadn't been physical in some impulsive moment. It had been a constructed, deliberate, long-running collaboration between two people who decided that my life, the life I'd poured everything into, was simply an obstacle to be moved. I read it all. I didn't cry. I thought I would cry, but what happened instead was something colder and much more quiet. A switch flipped somewhere deep in my chest. The man who'd loved Claire unconditionally for 11 years looked at those messages and felt that love drain out of him like water from a cracked container. And what filled the space instead wasn't hatred. Exactly. It was clarity. Pure, cold, devastating clarity. I took photos of everything. Every message. Every email. Every deleted thread I'd recovered. Every document in that folder. I photographed the pre-signed divorce papers. I documented the date. I documented the timestamp on my phone showing the exact minute I found them. Then I put the papers back exactly where I'd found them, beneath the sweater in the drawer. I closed the laptop. I walked to Emma's room, stood in the doorway, and watched my daughter sleep for a long time. She had her mother's nose and my stubbornness, and she was everything I'd ever done right in my life. I went back to the bedroom. Claire was still at her work dinner. The dinner I now knew was with Daniel. I sat in the dark and I made a phone call. My brother Ryan answered on the second ring despite it being nearly midnight. And I told him everything in a flat, controlled voice that he later told me scared him more than any version of crying would have. Ryan is an attorney, not a family attorney. He handles corporate litigation. But he knew people, and more importantly, he knew how things worked. Within 45 minutes of that phone call, he'd texted me the name and personal cell number of the best divorce attorney in our city, a man named Gordon Fitch, someone who'd spent 20 years watching people try to dismantle each other's lives, and who, according to Ryan, was so thorough and so aggressive that the opposing counsel usually requested a settlement before discovery was even complete. I texted Gordon Fitch at midnight. He texted back at 12:08 a.m. By the next morning, the morning Claire believed was the day she'd initiate the end of our marriage on her terms, I was sitting in Gordon's office with printed copies of every photograph I'd taken, and the recovery file from Claire's deleted email folder, and a complete financial document. I'd spent the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning compiling 9 years of tax returns, joint investment account statements. The business I'd built from scratch 7 years ago, which had grown into a design consultancy worth considerably more than Claire's attorney apparently knew when she drafted Claire's proposed asset division. Gordon looked at everything with the calm expression of a man who'd seen worse. He pushed his glasses up his nose, tapped the stack of documents, and said she'd made 3 critical errors. She hadn't accounted for the full business valuation. She'd moved $40,000 from the joint savings account a few months ago, thinking small increments wouldn't trigger a flag. And she'd forgotten that pre-signing divorce papers with a predetermined date constitutes evidence of premeditation in asset dissipation claims. He looked at me over his glasses. You came to me 18 hours before she planned to file. That's 18 hours I intend to use productively. I told him to do whatever the law allowed. Claire came home from her dinner at 11:15 that night. I was in bed. Lights off. I heard her move through the house with the practiced quiet of someone who'd been coming home late and lying about it for over a year. I heard her open the drawer. I heard her check the papers were still there. I heard her exhale with relief. I lay in the dark and I said nothing and I felt nothing. And the next morning I filed first. Gordon had worked through the night. The filing was time-stamped 7:52 a.m. March 17th, which Claire's attorney had apparently planned to file at 10 o'clock. Gordon filed at 7:52. In the state where we lived, the spouse who files first controls the initial narrative of the proceedings. And what Gordon filed wasn't a simple no-fault divorce petition. It was a comprehensive legal action citing documented evidence of marital asset dissipation. The $40,000. Emotional abandonment. Parental alienation through undisclosed communication. Preparing a minor child for family dissolution. And a request for a full forensic audit of all marital finances going back 5 years. He also filed an emergency motion to freeze all joint accounts pending the forensic audit. I didn't tell Claire any of this. I made Emma's lunch, drove her to school, kissed her forehead at the school gate, and went back home to wait while Claire's phone rang. I was in my office working, or performing the act of working, when I heard her voice change in the kitchen. That shift from normal speaking tone to something tighter and higher. I heard her say, "What do you mean he already filed?" I heard her say, "That's not possible." I heard her say, "Patricia, what does that mean for the accounts?" I kept working. She appeared in my office doorway at 9:51. She was wearing the gray blazer she knew I liked. Her hair was done. She'd put on the perfume she wore on important days because today was supposed to be her important day. "Kevin," she said. Her voice was strange. "Finn, I need to talk to you." I turned from my screen and looked at her. And I want to describe what her face looked like in that moment because it matters. She looked like someone who'd planned a surprise party for themselves and arrived to find the room empty. Not guilt yet. Not remorse. Just the specific vertigo of a plan failing in the first second of execution. "I know," I said. 2 words. That was all. And the color left her face completely. What followed wasn't the explosive confrontation the movies prepare you for. There was no throwing of objects. No screaming that rattled the windows. Though there were moments I wanted both of those things. What there was instead was worse. I opened my laptop and I turned it toward her and I showed her the photographs. All of them. The messages. The emails. Daniel's deposit receipt on the Denver apartment. Patricia Graves' email about the filing strategy. And her own pre-signed papers time-stamped in my photographs at 11:43 p.m. the night before. I watched her read them. I watched her try to find the version of this where she could still control the narrative. I could see it happening behind her eyes. That rapid recalculation. The search for an explanation that would give her back the advantage. Kevin, let me explain, she said. Daniel Holt, I said. 18 months. You told me he was nothing to worry about, and I believed you because you were my wife and I was stupid enough to think you were still the person I married. It's not. You don't understand what this has been like for me. I understand that you moved $40,000 out of our joint account. I understand that you told our 7-year-old daughter that you might be moving somewhere exciting without ever telling me. I understand that you signed divorce papers with tomorrow's date while you were sleeping in the same bed as me, telling me you didn't know what you'd do without me. The last sentence came out quiet and even, and I saw it hit her harder than any shouting would have. Her mouth opened and closed. Kevin, I'm sorry. The accounts are frozen, I said. Gordon Fitch filed this morning. The forensic audit starts Monday. You should call Patricia Graves. I stood up, took my laptop, and walked out of the room. I'm going to tell you something about what followed that I want you to understand precisely. I didn't act from rage. I acted from the evidence of her own choices reflected back at her with compound interest. Gordon moved with the efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work. The forensic audit revealed that the $40,000 wasn't the only movement. Over the 14 months, the exact length of the documented affair, Claire had shifted approximately $68,000 in small increments into a personal account I hadn't known existed. Opened at a bank we had no prior relationship with. In her name only. The audit also revealed that she'd used marital funds to pay for 2 trips she'd told me were architecture conferences. Denver both times. Daniel Hull lived in Denver. That information became part of the filing. The business valuation, when done properly by the forensic accountant Gordon retained, came in at 4 times what Claire's attorney had estimated. My consultancy, which I'd built from a single client and a desk in our spare room, while Claire was in her 3rd year at the architecture firm, was worth significantly more than anyone on her side of this had apparently bothered to properly research. Gordon told me that Patricia Graves had called his office twice in the first week trying to negotiate. Gordon told her there would be no negotiation until the forensic audit was complete. Patricia apparently found this upsetting. Gordon apparently didn't care. Ryan came over every other evening. He sat with me while I put Emma to bed. While I read her the same 3 chapters of the same book she always requested. While I tucked her blanket up to her chin and turned on her nightlight, and stood in her doorway for a moment the way I always did. Ryan sat in my kitchen and drank coffee. And when I came back downstairs, he didn't ask how I was doing because he could see how I was doing. Instead, he told me about the phone calls he'd been making. Ryan had grown up with me. He knew everyone I knew, which meant he knew everyone Claire knew, which meant he knew exactly which people in our social circle needed to know the truth, and which people Claire had probably already been quietly managing. There's a particular kind of person who, when they're planning to blow up their marriage, begins laying public relations groundwork months in advance. Little comments about feeling unsupported. Little sighs about how hard things have been. Little seeds planted so that when the explosion comes, the people around them already have a narrative that centers their pain. Claire had been doing this. Several of our mutual friends came to me in that first week, awkwardly, guilty, clearly feeling they'd been complicit in something, to tell me about conversations they'd had with her over the past year. She'd been building a sympathetic portrait of a woman in a difficult marriage. Nothing specific enough to be a lie exactly. Just enough to tilt the room in her direction before the game started. Ryan told the truth to the people who mattered. Not as gossip. Not as performance. He simply told them what had happened. Showed them what I'd shown him. And let them draw their own conclusions. And the people who were genuinely our friends, mine and Claire's together, almost universally responded the same way. Shock. Then anger. Then a quiet, meaningful distance from Claire that I didn't orchestrate, but that happened naturally when people learned the full picture. Her closest friend at the architecture firm, a woman named Priya, who'd been in our wedding, called me directly. She cried on the phone. She said she had no idea. I believed her. Priya stopped having lunch with Claire. More significantly, Priya mentioned in passing that the architecture firm had recently instituted a strict policy about personal conduct and conflict of interest, specifically after a senior partner incident the previous year. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. I didn't do anything with that information. Gordon did. It was Gordon who sent a carefully worded letter to the firm's HR department. Not accusatory, not aggressive, simply informative. Claire had used her professional conference budget for personal travel. Twice. The receipts were attached. Gordon noted in closing that he was sharing this information in the interest of accurate financial documentation for the ongoing divorce proceedings, and that the firm should feel no obligation to act on it, but that if they had any questions about the dates in question, he was available to provide supporting documentation. The firm put Claire on administrative leave pending an internal review. I found out because Claire called me. Her voice completely unrecognizable from the composed, careful woman she'd been managing herself into over the weeks of legal proceedings. She was crying in a way I'd only heard from her twice before. Once when her mother was sick. Once when we lost the first IVF attempt. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere that has no performance in it. Kevin, you got me put on leave. How could you do that? I didn't put you on leave, I said. I said you used marital funds for personal trips and submitted them as professional expenses. The documentation existed. My attorney included it in his filings because it was relevant to the audit. What your firm chose to do with that information is their decision. You're destroying my life, Claire. I let a silence sit between us. You signed divorce papers with yesterday's date 3 weeks ago. You'd already done that before any of this started. Everything happening to you right now is the consequence of choices you made. I'm just the person who found the papers. She hung up. I sat with my phone in my hand for a moment. I thought about the woman I'd loved. I thought about her sitting in the same graduate school orientation 20 years ago with her hair falling across her face. I allowed myself 30 seconds of grief for that memory. And then I put the phone down and I went back to work. The settlement conference happened on a Tuesday. Gordon had told me to expect Claire's side to finally be willing to talk seriously. He'd been right about everything else. And he was right about this. Patricia Graves had filed for 3 different continuances before the court stopped granting them. The forensic audit was complete. The asset picture was clear. And Claire's professional situation, still unresolved, had weakened her position in ways Patricia clearly understood. Even if Claire was still processing, I sat across a conference table from my wife for the first time since the morning I'd told her the accounts were frozen. She looked tired. The kind of tired that isn't fixed by sleep. She'd lost weight she hadn't needed to lose. She was wearing a blazer I didn't recognize. Something bought recently, perhaps to project confidence into a room where she no longer had any. Daniel Holt, I'd been told by Ryan, who'd been told by someone who knew someone, had not moved to Denver. The apartment deposit, it seemed, was refundable. He'd apparently found the reality of Claire's situation, the legal proceedings, the professional leave, the frozen accounts, the social fallout, considerably less appealing than the fantasy they'd been constructing in carefully deleted messages for 18 months. He hadn't said this directly to Claire. He'd simply become unavailable. First slow to respond, then not responding. Then a very brief message, which Ryan's contact had actually seen because Claire had shown it to a mutual acquaintance in a moment of despair, saying only that he thought they both needed space to figure things out separately. He'd built the exit ramp to her life, and then declined to walk it himself. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. I want to be honest. I felt nothing about Daniel Holt at all, which was perhaps the most complete form of contempt available. He wasn't worth a feeling. But Claire looked at me across the conference table, and I could see her trying to find a version of this moment where she still had leverage, still had options, still had a move. There were no moves. Gordon had made sure of that in the most professional and thorough and legally bulletproof way possible. The settlement gave me the house. Primary physical custody of Emma with generous visitation for Claire because Emma needed her mother even if her mother had made catastrophic choices. And I wouldn't be the kind of man who used my daughter as a weapon. The business remained wholly mine with full valuation. The recovered marital assets, including the $68,000 from the undisclosed account, were redistributed. Claire's attorney had asked for alimony. Gordon had laughed. Not mockingly. Just the quiet laugh of a man who found the request professionally interesting. Then he produced a document demonstrating Claire's earning capacity relative to mine. and the circumstances of the marital breakdown. Alimony was removed from the table without further discussion. It wasn't a vindictive settlement. It was simply an accurate one. It reflected what the marriage had actually been, what the contributions had actually been, and what the betrayal had actually cost. Patricia Graves pushed a final page across the table. I looked at it. I looked at Claire. I trusted you completely, I said. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just as a statement of fact. The way you'd note the weather. I never gave you a reason not to trust me back. I would have done anything you needed. If you were unhappy, I would have gone to therapy, changed things, worked harder, whatever it took. You didn't give me the chance. You just decided, and then you planned it out. And you lied to my face every single day for 18 months while I cooked dinner and drove Emma to school, and thought I was building a life with someone who was already gone. She was crying. She'd been crying for most of the conference. Real crying. Not strategic crying. I knew the difference by now. I'm sorry, she said. Kevin, I am so sorry. I don't know what I was. I know you're sorry, I said. That's not what I need from you. What I need is for you to be a good mother to Emma because she didn't do anything wrong, and she loves you, and she deserves to have you show up for her even though you didn't show up for me. I picked up the pen. I signed the settlement. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and I walked out of the conference room without looking back. 6 months after the settlement, Emma and I were living in the house that was now officially, legally, entirely mine. I'd repainted her bedroom the purple she'd been asking for since she was 5. I'd bought her the dog she'd been asking for since she was 6. A ridiculous, floppy-eared basset hound she named Captain Biscuit. And every morning the three of us had a version of breakfast that involved Captain Biscuit attempting to steal food and Emma shrieking with laughter, and me drinking coffee in the kitchen I'd kept, standing in the morning light that came through the east-facing window, and feeling something I'd genuinely not been certain I'd feel again. Peace. Uncomplicated. Quiet. Unearned by anyone else. Peace. And the consultancy had its best quarter since founding that summer. I brought in a partner, a woman named Diane, who I'd worked with on a project a couple years earlier, and who had the specific combination of skills and temperament the business needed to grow in the direction I wanted. We landed 3 new contracts in a few months. The work was good. The work had always been good. I'd simply been less present in it for years because I'd been investing that energy elsewhere. I started running again. I'd run seriously in my late 20s and stopped when life accumulated. I started again at 5 in the morning before Emma was up. Just me and the empty streets and the particular quality of pre-dawn air. Within a couple months, I'd signed up for a half marathon. Within a few months, I was training for a full one. The man in the mirror looked different from the man who'd buckled at the knees in a bedroom, holding pre-signed divorce papers. And I noticed the difference without vanity. Just as accurate information about what was possible when you stopped expending yourself on someone who wasn't doing the same. I heard about Claire the way you hear about people in a city you've both always lived in. Through the ambient information that moved through shared social networks without anyone specifically intending it. Her professional leave had resolved with a formal reprimand and reassignment to a lower profile position at the firm. She'd moved into an apartment across the city. She was seeing a therapist, apparently seriously, and several people who knew her told me she seemed to be genuinely grappling with what she'd done rather than simply managing the consequences of having gotten caught. I believed this because I wanted to believe it for Emma's sake, and because the alternative, that she had no insight at all into the damage she'd caused, was too depressing to sit with. Daniel Holt had moved to Austin. Not Denver. Austin. A different city in a different direction with presumably a different woman who didn't yet know what he was capable of helping someone plan. I genuinely, sincerely didn't think about him again after learning that he occupied no space in me at all. Emma's 8th birthday fell on a Saturday. She wanted a party with her school friends and Captain Biscuit in the backyard and a chocolate cake with a purple frosting that matched her newly painted bedroom. And I delivered all 3 of those things. 12 8-year-olds in my backyard. A basset hound wearing a party hat that he kept shaking off with great indignation. Chocolate cake with purple frosting that I'd made from scratch after watching 4 separate YouTube tutorials. Claire came. We'd established a civil, functional co-parenting arrangement that centered Emma absolutely and left no room for anything else between us. She came to the birthday party and she helped with the games, and she sang happy birthday with everyone else. And she held it together until the cake was cut. Then she stepped away to the side of the yard for a moment and I saw her pressing her fingers to her eyes. I didn't go over to her. That wasn't my role anymore. But I didn't look away either. Emma ran to her mother mid-party with a piece of cake on a paper plate, presented with the specific, proud generosity of a child who wants everyone she loves to share in good things. And Claire took the plate and looked at our daughter. And the expression on her face, the specific devastated gratitude of someone who knows exactly what they almost threw away, was something I saw clearly from across the yard. I turned back to the party. But Captain Biscuit had stolen a cupcake from the table, and 12 children were in unanimous pursuit. I started laughing before I could stop myself. Emma caught my eye from across the yard mid-run, and she grinned at me. Her whole face pure, uncomplicated joy. And I thought, there it is. That's the thing that was always worth protecting. A year after I found the papers, I ran my marathon. 4 hours and 11 minutes. Which was 11 minutes slower than my goal and approximately 40 minutes better than it should have been for someone who'd taken up serious running at 38. Ryan was at the finish line. Emma was at the finish line holding a hand-painted sign that said, "Go, Daddy, go," in the purple marker she used for everything. I crossed the line and Emma ran at me, and I picked her up even though I was destroyed. She wrapped her arms around my neck, and I stood there at the finish line with my daughter while the crowd moved around us. And I thought about the man who'd buckled at the knees in a dark bedroom. I thought about him the way you think about a version of yourself you've outgrown, with recognition and distance and a kind of gratitude for what the breaking had required you to become. That man had trusted completely and been destroyed by it. He'd found the papers. He'd made the call. He'd sat in Gordon's office and handed over the evidence with steady hands. He'd looked across a conference table at the person who'd planned his dissolution and signed his name and walked out of the room without looking back. He'd kept showing up for his daughter every single day without fail. He'd run a marathon. I set Emma down and Ryan clapped me on the shoulder and handed me a water bottle and said something I didn't hear over the noise of the crowd. And I didn't need to hear it because I could read his face. And his face said what it had been saying for a year. "I'm proud of you. You did it right. You're okay." I was okay. I was better than okay. I was standing in morning sunlight at the finish line of something I had run myself, with my daughter holding my hand, and my future genuinely and completely my own. And I felt the kind of peace that can only be built on the foundation of having survived something real. I never thought about Daniel Holt again. I thought about Claire occasionally, not with anger, not with longing, just with the mild, distant acknowledgement of someone who'd been important and was no longer. And those thoughts grew less frequent and less significant with each passing month until they occupied the same space in my mind as old weather, old news, events I'd witnessed that had happened to someone else. She'd signed the papers before I found them. That was the truest thing about all of it. She'd already decided I was done. She'd just miscalculated by 24 hours. 24 hours in which I found the papers, made the call, walked into Gordon's office, and filed first. 24 hours that changed the entire shape of what came after. The best thing she ever did was underestimate how much I was paying attention.